At 5:42 on March 17th, 1945, a gray, silent dawn settled over the small German town of Waldheim. The streets lay still beneath a thin veil of mist drifting in from the surrounding hills, the kind of muted morning light that seemed to press down on the ruins of the war-torn landscape. Shattered roof tiles hung from exposed rafters. Smoke rose gently from a collapsed barn near the southern road. The quiet felt unnatural, too complete, too deliberate, the kind of quiet that suggested not peace, but anticipation, something waiting, unseen, just beyond the edges of visibility. For the American infantry of the 310th Regiment, advancing east after securing the Remagen bridgehead, Waldheim was supposed to be another routine objective, a nameless settlement on the road toward the Ruhr. Their maps showed a cluster of farmhouses, a church steeple, and two intersecting roads forming the town center. Nothing unusual, nothing suggesting that a few hundred men would soon be halted, stunned, and forced into cover by a single German machine of steel and precision. The regiment had pushed hard over the previous week, crossing the Rhine under constant artillery harassment, consolidating ground on the far bank, and expanding the American foothold. Morale was steady. Supplies were stable. Yet fatigue clung to the soldiers like a second uniform. Many had slept barely 3 hours the night before. Some had not slept at all. The thunder of distant German guns had rolled across the night air in uneven patterns, echoing through their bivouac positions. It reminded them that the war, though turning decisively in their favor, was far from finished and far from predictable. The preliminary reconnaissance teams entered the outskirts shortly after sunrise. They moved cautiously through fields scarred with craters and churned mud, passing burnt-out carts and abandoned tools. They expected minor resistance, perhaps a few riflemen in scattered houses, perhaps a machine gun nest left behind to delay American advance. Instead, they found nothing. Not a single figure on the road, not a movement behind a window, not a sign of retreating German infantry. Even the animals were absent. No cattle, no horses, no dogs barking from farmyards. The emptiness felt deliberate, almost crafted. Behind them, the main body of the regiment approached in staggered formation. Rifle companies moved along both sides of the road, while support units followed farther back. The men spoke quietly among themselves, noting the unusual silence and the absence of even sporadic sniper fire. The earth had that heavy, metallic smell that always followed nights of artillery. The mist thickened briefly, then thinned again, drifting through broken doorways and shattered glass. Every step forward carried the unspoken question of what lay inside the town center. What the Americans did not yet know was that a single German Panther tank, belonging to the remnants of a Panzer regiment shattered weeks earlier, had taken up a concealed position inside Waldheim shortly before dawn. Its commander, a veteran non-commissioned officer who had survived Normandy, the Falaise Pocket, and the retreat across the Rhine, had chosen one of the most defensible crossroads in the region. The Panther sat wedged between collapsed masonry walls that shielded it from distant recon planes and limited the angles of approach. Its dark silhouette merged with the burned-out remains of nearby houses. Only its long, high-velocity 75mm gun pointed outward toward the fields beyond the town, carefully aligned to cover the main road the Americans now advanced along. The decision to leave just one tank behind was not made out of confidence, but necessity. The German forces retreating farther east lacked fuel, ammunition, and manpower. Their logistical collapse left armored vehicles scattered across roadsides, abandoned by crews who could do nothing more for them. Waldheim's Panther, however, still had enough fuel for a few hours of operation and enough shells for 15, perhaps 16 shots. Not many by wartime standards, but enough to delay an enemy column. Enough to hold a town for long minutes that might mean something to the retreating battalions beyond the hills. enough to make the advancing Americans believe they faced something far larger than the single machine hidden before them. The Panther's crew had prepared through the night. They had cleared rubble to create a narrow field of fire. They had positioned the turret at a slight angle to increase ricochet chances. They had calculated distance markers along the road, estimating where the first enemy vehicles would appear. The loader stacked armor-piercing shells within easy reach. The gunner adjusted the elevation wheel in measured movements. The engine remained silent, cold, conserving fuel. Only the faint scrape of metal inside the hull broke the stillness as the crew settled into their positions. By mid-morning, the first American platoons reached the southern edge of Waldheim. They advanced with discipline, rifles raised, eyes scanning doorways and windows. The town remained quiet, too quiet. Yet there were no muzzle flashes, no hidden rifles firing from attics. The men moved past broken market stalls and overturned furniture that littered the town center. They approached the crossroads, unaware that the Panther's gun sight had already captured their silhouettes. At 10:17 a.m., the stillness shattered. A single flash erupted from behind the collapsed stone wall. The sound tore through the town like a rolling thunderclap. Dust exploded from the road behind the leading squad as the first 75mm round struck with devastating force. The blast threw shattered bricks across the street and sent soldiers diving behind anything that offered cover: stone troughs, broken door frames, piles of debris. The Americans had no warning, no indication of where the shot came from. The echo bounced between the narrow streets, giving the impression of multiple guns when, in reality, only one had fired. Before the dust settled, the second shot roared out. It punched cleanly through the wall of a two-story building near the advancing platoon, scattering shards of stone into the street below. The concussion forced several soldiers to press flat against the ground, covering their helmets with both hands. The platoon leader signaled for men to pull back, regroup, and identify the threat. But the angles were tight, the buildings close together, and the enemy gun remained invisible, masked perfectly by the ruins. Rumors spread instantly among the infantry. Some believed multiple tanks were firing from different positions. Others assumed an entire armored company had taken up positions inside the town. The precision of the shots, the force of the explosions, and the impossibility of locating the source created a growing unease. This was no random delaying force. This was a trained crew, disciplined and patient, using the town's narrow layout as a weapon. Within minutes, the advancing American elements halted. They dug into shallow positions, stacking rubble into makeshift barricades, scanning for the glint of a barrel or the movement of treads. Communications officers relayed reports back to the regimental headquarters. Enemy armor present, unknown number, accurate fire, blocking advance. The Panther, meanwhile, remained silent after its second shot, deliberately silent, knowing that unpredictability was its greatest weapon. Across Waldheim, the tension thickened. The Americans found themselves held in place by a single unseen presence. A steel predator hidden within the ruins. A tank that had turned an entire town into a trap of angles, shadows, and blind corners. It was only the beginning. For more American attempts to advance would be halted. Several squads would find themselves pinned in alleys they couldn't escape, and rumors would grow into certainty. The enemy armor inside Waldheim was not just holding a position. It was controlling the pace of the entire battle with a precision that felt almost impossible. The regiment had prepared for many challenges on their way into Germany, but none of them expected that one Panther, operating alone, nearly out of ammunition, would have the power to halt their advance and leave entire companies stunned by the scale of its resistance. The American command staff gathered in a sheltered courtyard at the southern edge of Waldheim, studying hastily drawn sketches made by reconnaissance soldiers who had attempted to penetrate deeper into the town. The problem was immediately clear. The narrow streets formed a grid of bottlenecks, dead ends, and angled lanes that favored a defender hidden behind layers of rubble. The German tank, still unseen by any man in the regiment, had positioned itself with remarkable foresight. It occupied a zone where no squad could approach without stepping into a perfect line of fire. The Panther had turned geometry itself into a weapon. The Panther's 75mm KWK 42 gun was notorious among Allied officers. Its velocity, flat trajectory, and precision made it one of the most feared weapons on the European front. At long distances, it could punch through the armor of Shermans with stark ease. At close range, it could obliterate obstacles, scatter masonry, and tear through cover. Yet the gun's true power came not only from its shell, but from the accuracy of a trained gunner who understood the rhythm of battle. In Waldheim, the Panther crew demonstrated precisely that skill. They did not fire rapidly. They fired selectively, patiently, choosing targets that would cause maximum confusion. When American engineers attempted to approach the crossroads by slipping through a narrow lane on the east side of town, the tank remained silent until they had committed fully. Then a single round detonated against a stone wall 5 meters from their position, sending splinters of rock through the group and forcing them into full retreat. Medics pulled 2 wounded back under covering fire. The engineers reported that the shot came from a low angle, suggesting the tank sat hull down, one of the most advantageous defensive positions possible. The Panther's commander, a veteran Feldwebel named Erich Mertens, understood the significance of every shell he expended. He spoke to his crew only in clipped, efficient commands inside the cramped steel interior of the tank. His loader, operating in near darkness, moved with mechanical precision, preparing each round with the care of a craftsman working on his final masterpiece. The gunner kept his eye pressed against the sight, scanning for silhouettes, movement, or a flash of sunlight on metal. They operated not with the frenzy of desperation, but with the cold focus of professionals who had accepted their fate but refused to waste a single opportunity. The Americans, meanwhile, adjusted their strategy. Infantry alone would not be able to push forward. They requested armor support from a tank battalion positioned several miles behind the front line. 2 Sherman tanks advanced cautiously along the main road, their engines rumbling, treads grinding against broken pavement. Their commanders expected to engage a damaged or lightly positioned enemy tank. They did not yet understand the precision and lethality waiting ahead. As the Shermans approached the outskirts of Waldheim, the Panther's gunner spotted them through a gap between 2 ruined houses. He calculated distance, corrected for elevation, and waited for the precise moment when the lead Sherman entered the narrow curve near the town's central well. Only half the tank's hull was visible, but it was enough. The Panther fired. The round struck the Sherman's glassy plate at a steep angle. The impact threw sparks into the air and sent a shockwave through the American vehicle, stunning the crew inside. The tank lurched backward in a haze of smoke, its front armor dented and beginning to buckle. The second Sherman tried to maneuver around debris on the left-hand side of the road, but before it could adjust its angle, a second round struck. The armor-piercing shell tore into the track assembly, shearing metal links and damaging the idler wheel. The track failed instantly. The immobilized Sherman ground to a halt, stuck at an awkward angle that blocked any further armored advance. The crew scrambled to regain control of their situation, but the damage was done. The Panther's 2 shots had neutralized the only armored support the infantry had managed to bring forward in the first hour. Reports filtered back to the regimental staff. A single enemy tank had disabled 2 Shermans with alarming accuracy. The shock among the infantry spread quickly. They had encountered Panthers before, but rarely under circumstances where the enemy had the advantage of concealment and terrain to such an extent. Many soldiers had grown accustomed to enemy withdrawals, disorganized defenses, and scattered last-ditch efforts. Waldheim felt different. The fire coming from the hidden tank carried not desperation, but control. American officers ordered mortars into position. They set up tubes behind a row of farm buildings outside town and began launching high-explosive rounds toward suspected enemy positions. The shells arced overhead, exploding inside Waldheim with tremendous concussions that shook loose bricks from damaged houses. Some blasts landed dangerously close to the Panther's location, showering it with fragments of tile and wood. Inside the tank, dust fell from weld joints and rattled against the ammunition racks. But the Panther remained operational. Its armor absorbed the shock. Its crew steadied themselves. The gunner wiped grit from his optics and continued searching for targets. The mortar barrage lasted 10 minutes. When it ceased, American scouts once again inched forward, advancing between piles of debris and overturned carts. The smoke had thickened across the town's center, creating an eerie fog that obscured movement. Yet despite the barrage, despite the destruction, the Panther had not been knocked out. It had not retreated. It had not shifted position. Instead, at the moment when the American scouts believed they were making progress, the tank fired again. This time the shell hit a stone archway above a narrow alley. The explosion collapsed the arch, sending a cascade of rubble directly into the path of the advancing scouts. 2 men were buried up to their waists in debris. The platoon withdrew once more. Every attempt to push forward resulted in immediate and precise fire from the concealed tank. Its commander understood the terrain so thoroughly that he seemed to predict exactly where the Americans would move next. Inside the regimental headquarters, tension rose. Senior officers debated options. Air support was not immediately available due to low cloud cover and the risk of friendly fire inside the town. Artillery could be called, but risked flattening civilian structures and causing casualties among their own advancing infantry. Engineers suggested using smoke screens to obscure movement, but shifting winds would disperse the smoke too quickly to be reliable. Each solution presented new problems, new risks, and new delays. The Panther, meanwhile, maintained a chilling discipline. It did not fire recklessly. It did not waste ammunition. Every shot it fired served a purpose: delay, disruption, intimidation. The Americans, unsure of how many tanks they faced, reassessed their assumptions. Some believed the Germans had positioned multiple vehicles inside the town, rotating their firing positions to avoid detection. Others suggested a full panzer detachment had been left behind to defend Waldheim. The reality that a single tank with a crew of 5 men held a town against hundreds had not yet become clear. By early afternoon, the psychological effects had begun to show. Infantrymen kept low even in areas previously deemed safe. Movement slowed to a crawl. Every shadow in a doorway, every glint of light off broken glass felt like a potential gun barrel. The sound of one tank had imposed the illusion of an entire armored force. The Panther had achieved more than a tactical delay. It had seized control of the tempo, dictating how an entire American regiment moved, thought, and reacted. The Americans prepared for a more coordinated assault. They reviewed new maps, repositioned machine gun squads, and prepared smoke grenades and anti-tank teams. But the Panther's crew, listening to distant shuffling and movement in the ruins, understood an escalation was coming. They steadied their nerves, checked ammunition, and prepared for the moment when the battle would grow far more intense. The single German Panther, battered, isolated, low on shells, remained unbroken. And the Americans, now fully aware that something extraordinary awaited them inside Waldheim, prepared for another attempt. One that would test how much punishment one tank could truly deliver. By mid-afternoon, the field south of Waldheim had filled with movement as American officers coordinated a more deliberate push into the town. The regiment had been stalled far longer than expected, and every passing hour increased the risk of German reinforcements withdrawing through the woods beyond the ridge. The Americans could not afford delays. They had to secure Waldheim, and they had to determine what enemy force was holding it with such precision. Reports filtered through that German infantry might be in hiding, waiting for the Panther to pin American units so they could counterattack. Others suspected that a network of fortifications encircled the crossroads. The idea that a single tank, alone and unsupported, could hold an entire town was almost unthinkable. Behind the southern hedgerows, rifle squads repositioned around a series of stone farmhouses, laying out ammunition, redistributing grenades, and checking bar and machine gun belts. Engineers prepared satchel charges and examined the terrain for possible routes of approach. The dirt carried the faint smell of smoke drifting from the town, a reminder of the mortar fire earlier that day. Several medics tended to wounded men who had been caught by debris or shrapnel from earlier blasts. Their bandages, stained and hastily applied, illustrated just how precise the Panther's shots had been. These are not random impacts. Each shell had been placed with a kind of cold calculation. American officers decided to divide the assault into several coordinated stages. Infantry would probe from multiple directions, attempting to force the Panther to reveal its position. Bazooka teams would move behind cover, prepared to fire the moment the tank exposed its hull. Machine gun squads would suppress suspected firing lanes. Engineers would follow to clear paths through rubble. It was a textbook operation if the enemy force had been predictable. But the Panther was not predictable. It had already demonstrated an uncanny ability to fire at the precise moment American troops crossed into its line of sight. The first renewed assault began at 15:10, under the cover of smoke grenades thrown across the southern street. Two rifle squads moved forward along opposite sides of the road, staying low and using the ruins for cover. Smoke drifted in thick clouds, obscuring visibility and clinging to the edges of broken walls. The soldiers advanced in short bursts, listening for the telltale metallic crack of the Panther's main gun. They hoped the smoke would throw off the German gunner, forcing him to wait too long or fire inaccurately. But the smoke did little to hinder the Panther. Through the haze, its gunner glimpsed shadows moving between the silhouettes of ruined buildings. The tank remained silent until the precise moment the smoke thinned and a group of soldiers crossed a narrow intersection near the town square. The shot that followed blasted through the side of a collapsed bakery, sending a cloud of flour into the air like a pale explosion of dust. The concussion knocked several men off their feet and threw shards of wood across the road. The soldiers fell back immediately. The Panther had fired through smoke, through shifting visibility, and hit its target with near-perfect accuracy. Two more shots followed within moments. One struck a trolley car overturned near the fountain, scattering metal fragments like shrapnel. The other hit a low stone wall that several Americans had been using for cover. The wall collapsed in a wave of dust and debris. By the time the smoke fully cleared, the assault had stalled once again. Officers realized the Panther was firing not at random targets, but at choke points, specific angles where advancing infantry had no ability to maneuver. The tank had turned the entire central square into a killing ground. The Americans withdrew once more, regrouping behind his southern houses. Their frustration grew. They had faced tanks before, but not under such constrained urban conditions, and not one with such a disciplined and experienced crew. Many soldiers whispered now that the Panther's gunner must be a veteran marksman, perhaps a survivor of Kursk or Normandy. Others believed the crew was rotating firing positions, unaware that the tank had not moved a single meter since dawn. Still, the Americans adapted. After several minutes of tense regrouping, a second plan was formed. If infantry could not safely approach from the south, perhaps an assault from the east would create an opening. The eastern road leading into Waldheim narrowed between two large buildings that had partially collapsed onto the street. Engineers believed the team might be able to slip through that narrow corridor undetected, getting close enough for a bazooka team to fire before the Panther could rotate its turret. A small group of soldiers moved eastward through an overgrown orchard, taking advantage of the natural cover. The grass, still damp from a morning dew, brushed against their boots. Crows perched on skeletal tree branches scattered briefly at their approach. The stillness of the air felt oppressive. Every man knew that if the Panther spotted them, the narrow road could become a death trap. But the opportunity was too valuable to ignore. As the team reached the gap between the two fallen buildings, they prepared the bazooka. The assistant gunner loaded the rocket, ensuring the charge was secure and the launching tube was clear. The bazooka operator steadied himself behind a slab of broken stone. He waited, breathing slowly, watching the square through a crack between the buildings. The town's center remained hazy with dust, but there was no sign of movement. What the Americans did not know was that the Panther had already identified this approach hours earlier. The crew had noted the narrow street on the eastern side and prepared a firing angle specifically for it. The gunner had marked distance measurements on the inside of the turret with chalk. The loader kept armor-piercing rounds within arm's reach. They expected an attempt from this direction. They were ready. At 15:38, the bazooka operator eased forward to adjust his aim. In that subtle movement, his helmet reflected a faint glimmer of sunlight through the crack in the wall. It lasted only half a second, but it was enough. The Panther's shot followed instantly. The shell smashed into the stone at the end of the corridor. The explosion swallowed the narrow passage in a wave of dust, shattered brick, and pulverized mortar. The blast force knocked the bazooka team backward, throwing them into the orchard behind them. Shards of stone ripped through tree trunks. Several men lay stunned, half buried beneath debris. Medics sprinted forward, hauling them into cover as the dust settled over the orchard like drifting ash. The Panther had anticipated the maneuver perfectly. Its accuracy suggested a crew operating on instinct and memory, drawing on years of battlefield experience. The Americans were stunned. Their second coordinated attempt had failed as decisively as the first. The psychological pressure grew heavier. The sense of facing an enemy force far larger than reality intensified. Further west, another group attempted to slip through a series of courtyards and gardens, hoping to reach the town center from behind. They found themselves funneled between high stone walls covered in ivy. As they closed in on the square, silence hung thick around them. Not even the sound of the tank's idling engine reached their ears. They paused, preparing for the next movement. The Panther fired again. The round struck a cast-iron lamppost at the corner of a courtyard, shearing it cleanly in half and sending fragments of iron in every direction. The shockwave punched through the courtyards and threw several soldiers against the stable wall. Again, the men were forced to retreat. The Panther crew had predicted the western approach as well. Their understanding of the town's geography bordered on architectural precision. Every American attempt to outmaneuver the tank was met with immediate and devastating fire. By late afternoon, the regiment had been forced into a stalemate. No squad could advance more than a few dozen meters without risking direct exposure to the Panther's gun. The tank's position, its discipline, and its methodical firing patterns had transformed Waldheim into a fortress defended by a single machine. American officers now faced a difficult reality. The Panther appeared immovable, and the regiment's infantry, armor, and engineers had failed to clear even a path into the town center. As the light began to fade, casting long shadows across the ruins, the Americans prepared for a final coordinated push. They would bring all available assets to bear. They would attempt to flush out the tank by sheer force, not finesse. But the Panther, scarred by shrapnel and coated in dust, remained vigilant. Its crew sat in the dim interior, exhausted but resolute. They understood that the decisive moment was still ahead, and the Americans, stunned by the tank's endurance, recognized the truth they had tried to avoid all day. They were not facing a scattered remnant force. They were facing a single Panther that had already rewritten the boundaries of what one machine could do. This evening settled over Waldheim. The fading daylight cast long horizontal beams across the broken roofs and fractured streets, turning shattered glass into dull reflections of orange and gray. The Americans understood they had only a short window remaining before darkness made coordination far more difficult. Yet the Panthers' unbroken presence at the heart of the town had imposed a kind of tension that radiated outward in every direction. Soldiers spoke in low, strained tones as officers prepared the final assault plan. The day had already cost them wounded men, stalled momentum, and a growing sense of disbelief that a single tank had stalled such a large force. The coordinated operation would involve every tool the regiment could bring forward without calling for high-risk artillery inside the town. Machine gun teams would establish suppressive fire from two directions. Mortar crews would drop rounds deeper into the crossroads, hoping to disorient the Panther crew. Engineers carrying satchel charges would attempt to close the distance from the north. A bazooka team from headquarters company, still uncommitted, would follow behind the engineers. And a small group of riflemen would push through a cluster of collapsed stables on the west side, using their proximity to approach the tank's blind angles. The operation had more moving parts than any previous attempt. Failure would mean waiting until morning and risking retreating German units regrouping beyond the hills. At 1752, mortar fire resumed. The first shells dropped into the center of Waldheim, shaking the ground and drawing clouds of dust upward into the twilight air. Roof tiles clattered onto the cobblestones. A wave of smoke spread across the square, spilling into surrounding streets. The explosions echoed in long, hollow tones between the stone walls. The mortarmen adjusted range and continued firing, establishing a steady rhythm intended to suppress the tank. Inside the Panther, smoke crept through small seams around the turret ring as the tank rocked gently from the concussions. The gunner kept his eye to the sight, wiping away dust after each shock. The loader steadied himself as vibrations rattled the ammunition racks. Their world had narrowed to a dim metal chamber filled with machinery, sweat, and the familiar-smelling dust of collapsing masonry. They knew that an attack was coming. They could hear faint movement among the ruins, too coordinated to be stray civilians, too deliberate to be isolated scouts. The commander understood that the Americans were preparing to commit fully. This moment, the moment of the decisive push, was the moment the tank would suffer its greatest risk. The Americans moved as soon as the mortar barrage paused. From the south, two machine gun teams opened sustained fire toward the crossroads, their tracers cutting faint arcs through the fading light. They aimed at windows, archways, and other positions that the Panther might use to spot advancing infantry. The firing was not aimed at destroying the tank. It was meant to force its crew into operating under pressure. From the east, engineers advanced among the rubble with slow, careful movements. They carried satchel charges slung over their shoulders, each weighing enough to tear open the side of a fortified position. The narrow roads remained dangerous, but the engineers pressed on, using the mortar smoke as partial cover. They knew that if the tank spotted them, a single round would destroy the entire team. On the west side, riflemen climbed over fallen beams and navigated through broken livestock pens. The stables, though ruined, offered concealment from the Panther's limited field of fire. Broken wooden frames and collapsed roof sections created shadows deep enough to mask movement. The Americans pressed forward, stepping over shattered planks and dried mud. They spread out, trying not to form a single concentrated target. The bazooka team followed behind the engineers from the north. The weapon was heavy and awkward to carry, especially through unstable terrain filled with broken walls. The assistants kept the warheads protected, cradling them carefully while they navigated low stone fences. They whispered brief confirmations to one another, adjusting to the shifting smoke that rolled unpredictably through the streets. In the center of Waldheim, the Panther remained still. The engine had not been started since dawn. The silence helped conceal its exact position, and the crew knew that engine noise could give away their location to approaching bazooka teams. The commander waited, listening for movements in the rubble. The gunner continued to sweep his sight across the southern intersection, the eastern corridor, and the western lanes. The loader double-checked the ammunition stack, keeping armor-piercing rounds within quickest reach. At 1814, the American engineers made the first critical movement. They crossed a narrow break in the rubble where two walls had collapsed into one another, leaving only a small opening. It was barely wide enough for 3 men to pass through at crouching height. As the first engineer emerged, the Panther's gunner caught the faint disturbance of dust drifting in the air. He adjusted his sight by a few centimeters and focused on the gap. The shot came instantly. The shell tore through the narrow corridor in a violent burst of stone and earth. The blast flattened the lead engineer and swallowed the opening in a cloud of debris. Men scrambled backward, coughing and shielding their faces from the wave of dust. The satchel charges tumbled across the ground. The engineers were thrown into disarray. The Panther had once again revealed its uncanny ability to strike precisely where the Americans planned to advance. At the same time, the riflemen on the west side continued pressing toward the square. They reached a low garden wall that overlooked a section of the crossroads. From their new vantage point, the Panther's gun barrel was partially visible, a dark silhouette against the smoldering ruin behind it. It was still angled toward the south, unaware of the rifleman's exact position. For the first time, the Americans had visual confirmation of the tank. They signaled for the bazooka team to advance more quickly. But the Panther's commander had heard the movement. The tank's turret rotated slowly, grinding through debris with a metallic groan. The riflemen froze, hoping the tank would miss their position. They pressed against the low wall, controlling their breathing. If the Panther saw them, the wall would offer no protection at such close range. The turret turned further. The gunner scanned the western approach. The riflemen remained just below the gun's line of fire. They were safe for now. To the north, the bazooka team reached a narrow alley between two undamaged farmhouses. This alley offered a direct but extremely risky approach to the Panther's rear quarter. The team moved forward, stepping carefully over broken bricks. They could see the faint outline of the tank's turret through the smoke. The operator lifted the bazooka, bracing it on a fallen beam. The assistant quietly prepared the rocket, sliding it into the launch tube. But before the team could fire, the Panther struck again. The tank's machine gun opened with a sudden burst, sweeping the northern alley in a stream of precise, controlled fire. Dust and plaster exploded from the farmhouse walls. The bazooka operator dropped flat, the rocket still inside the tube. The assistant dragged him backward into cover. The machine gun fire stopped as quickly as it began. It was enough to break their approach, enough to delay the shot they had hoped would end the battle. The Panther had not yet fired its main gun toward the western riflemen, but it had repositioned slightly, narrowing their window of safety. The turret now lay angled midway between the southern road and the western courtyard. It was a precarious position for the riflemen. They needed the bazooka team to launch their attack immediately. Every second increased the risk of discovery. The American officers observing from the southern edge realized the entire assault was beginning to collapse under the same pressure that had stalled every previous attempt. Engineers were scattered, riflemen were pinned, and the bazooka team could not advance under the Panther's persistent fire. The tank had not moved, yet it felt like it controlled the entire town through sheer precision. As darkness deepened, the Americans made a final push to bring the operation back under control. Officers shouted orders for flamethrower teams to move forward. Communications runners carried messages between scattered units. The mortar crews prepared another volley even as their visibility deteriorated in the fading light. The Panther, however, remained calm. The crew operated under a growing sense of inevitability. They had held the town for an entire day against overwhelming numbers. They had disabled armor, stalled infantry, and shattered coordinated assaults. Yet they knew their ammunition was nearly gone. Only a handful of shells remained, perhaps 5 or 6. The loader counted them repeatedly, knowing each one represented a fleeting moment of survival. As the final mortar volley arced overhead, the Panther's commander braced himself. The concussions shook the tank violently. Dust poured down from the turret ring. The air inside the hull grew thick. But the crew endured it with stoic familiarity, gripping the controls tightly until the barrage ceased. Then the commander gave the order to fire again. The gunner sighted on the western courtyard and fired a shell that tore through the low garden wall, sending debris cascading over the riflemen crouched behind it. The blast knocked them off their feet and forced them to retreat deeper into the ruins. The westward threat was neutralized, at least temporarily. The Americans, watching another breakthrough collapse, fell in almost surreal disbelief. A single tank, immobile, isolated, and with limited ammunition, had survived every coordinated assault thrown at it. It had answered every maneuver with precision. It had forced an entire regiment to fight for inches. Night approached. A difficult truth settled across the scattered American positions. They would need one final attempt, one decisive effort, one risk that carried the weight of the entire day. The Panther had endured everything so far, but its ammunition was nearly gone, and the Americans, though weary and frustrated, were not finished. The coming hours would determine whether the tank's final stand in Waldheim would remain unbroken, or whether the regiment would finally break through the iron shadow that had held them all day. Night fell slowly over Waldheim, turning the shattered silhouettes of the town into dark, angular shapes against a faint blue horizon. The fires started by the mortar strikes flickered weakly within collapsed structures, casting trembling reflections across broken windows and scattered debris. The last moments of daylight faded behind the distant ridge, leaving the Americans with a choice they could not avoid: commit to one final effort or abandon the assault until morning. But leaving the town in German hands, even overnight, carried risks. Retreating Wehrmacht units beyond the woods might regroup, establish new defensive lines, or reinforce the Panther with infantry. The Americans knew that delaying could cost them far more lives. The final push had to be made now. The regiment reorganized along the southern edge of Waldheim. The air held a cold stillness that pressed into every fold of clothing, every crevice in ruined stonework. Soldiers crouched behind walls, checking ammunition in the dim light. Rifle barrels gleamed faintly. Helmets rested low against shadowed brows. Medics made final rounds, adjusting bandages and offering brief nods of reassurance. The quiet concentration that settled over the ranks was a kind of collective resolve. Exhaustion weighed heavily, but determination outweighed it. American officers reviewed the last available strategy. Earlier attempts had failed individually, but together they had revealed the limitations of the Panther's firing arcs. The tank controlled the south, east, and west approaches, but its rear remained partially exposed behind a collapsed warehouse. The obstacle that had seemed unreachable throughout the day now presented the only viable route. It required climbing across unstable rubble, crossing a narrow courtyard, and approaching the tank from an angle so tight that a single misstep would expose soldiers to a point-blank shell. But it was the one path the Panther had not fired upon directly, the one path it could not fully see. The plan formed in silence. A rifle platoon would create a diversion along the eastern street, drawing the turret forward. Machine gun teams would suppress the southern road to prevent the tank from retargeting. A small team of engineers, accompanied by a single bazooka team, would circle through the western stables under cover of darkness, using the rubble to approach the Panther's rear. If they reached it, a single well-placed rocket could end the confrontation. If they failed, the day-long battle would deepen into uncertainty, and dawn would bring new dangers. At 1926, the diversion began. Riflemen advanced along the eastern street, firing controlled bursts toward the crossroads, striking walls and windows to simulate a larger force. The sound ricocheted between buildings, magnified by the town's tight geometry. To the south, machine gun teams opened fire into the air above the crossroads, sending streams of tracers streaking across the night sky. Their bright arcs illuminated drifting dust and shattered beams, revealing fleeting outlines of the Panther's concealed location. Inside the tank, the crew tightened their focus. The gunner saw flashes of movement in the east and rotated the turret toward the source. The loader positioned an armor-piercing shell into the breech. The commander steadied himself, listening for shifts in the pattern of American fire. They had fewer than 5 shells left. Each one had a count. They waited for the precise moment when the diversion exposed a legitimate target. While the Panther's turret moved, the engineers and bazooka team slipped through the western ruins. They climbed over fallen beams, stepping carefully across sections of cracked stone. The night air carried the distant tremor of gunfire as the diversion intensified. The engineers moved through a narrow stable corridor where shattered wooden walls hung precariously. They advanced slowly, feeling their way through the debris with gloved hands. Every footstep echoed faintly, but the noise of the diversion masked their presence. The ruined warehouse behind the Panther loomed ahead, a jagged silhouette with beams jutting upward like broken ribs. The ground beneath the engineers was uneven and littered with tiles, shrapnel, and shattered pottery. They paused briefly at the edge of a broken retaining wall, staring at the open courtyard beyond. Through drifting smoke, the faint outline of the Panther's rear hull was visible, its armor plate coated with dust. The massive engine deck lay partially exposed beneath debris, but enough of it remained intact to identify weak points. The tank had not moved all day. Its tracks were firmly wedged in rubble, its rear pressed against the foundation of the collapsed warehouse. The bazooka operator prepared the weapon. The assistant handled the rocket carefully, checking its fins in the faint moonlight. The engineers held their breath, listening for any sound from the tank. The Panther's turret was still turned toward the east, responding to the diversion. This was the moment they had waited for, a moment carved from a day of repeated failure. But before they fired, the Panther responded to the diversion with another shell. The roar shook the town. The shell blasted through a building facade on the eastern street, scattering debris across the stone pavement. The diversion team fell back deeper behind cover. Fragments of masonry rained down across the area. Hearing the blast from behind the tank, the engineers froze, waiting for signs that the Panther's turret might rotate again. The faint grinding of gears echoed through the rubble as the turret shifted slightly, adjusting its aim. The engineers pressed lower behind the retaining wall, hearts pounding. The bazooka operator steadied the tube on a broken beam. The assistant loaded the rocket. The weapon was heavy and difficult to balance, and the angle was awkward. They lifted the tube slowly, aligning it with the Panther's engine compartment. The slightest metallic sound could give away their position. They exhaled quietly, controlling their trembling breath. For a moment, the battlefield held its breath with them. Then the bazooka fired. The backblast shook dust from the walls and filled the courtyard with a sudden flash of white light. The rocket streaked toward the Panther's rear, its warhead glowing faintly as it impacted the engine plate. A violent explosion followed, sending sparks, smoke, and fragments of steel in all directions. The blast tore into the Panther's engine compartment, shattering cooling vents and rupturing internal components. Flames burst upward through the engine grills, casting flickering orange reflections across the warehouse ruins. Inside the Panther, the impact jolted the crew violently. The interior lights flickered. Smoke poured into the hull through the damaged engine vents. The gunner braced himself as the tank shuddered and the turret controls momentarily stalled. Alarms rang inside the vehicle as the engine coughed, sputtered, and died. The commander understood immediately. The tank had been struck at its most vulnerable point. They were no longer combat effective. Even so, the gunner attempted to fire one last round. With exhausting effort, he rotated the turret a final few degrees, searched for movement through the narrow sight, and steadied his hand on the elevation wheel. The loader pushed one of their last shells into the breach. The tank rocked slightly as flames intensified behind them. Heat pressed against the crew's backs. The shell fired. The round struck a stone facade near the diversion team, throwing debris into the air and shaking loose several roof tiles. The blast revealed the Panther's position to every American unit in the town. Flames rising from the engine deck illuminated its shape, a massive, wounded silhouette struggling against the night. At that moment, the Americans understood the truth that had eluded them all day. This was not a company of tanks, not a hidden armor division, not a fortified position reinforced with heavy guns. It was one Panther, one crew, and yet it had held them from morning until night. Engineers rushed forward as the Panther's flames grew stronger. The tank's armor glowed faintly as internal fire spread. Ammunition inside the hull began to pop with muted bursts. The turret ceased movement. Smoke rose in dark plumes, drifting across the square. The battle for Waldheim was over. American infantry secured the crossroads cautiously, spreading out across the square and checking corners for any additional threats. They found none. No German infantry remained in the town. No minefields or hidden emplacements. The Panther had stood alone. As medics tended to the wounded and officers recorded the events of the day, soldiers gathered around the burning tank. For many of them, disbelief slowly transformed into a quiet recognition of what they had witnessed. One machine, outdated, isolated, and outnumbered, had delayed an entire regiment with a precision and discipline seldom seen. The following morning, after the fires died down, the Americans examined the Panther closely. Its exterior was scarred with shrapnel, mortar fragments, and bullet marks. The tracks were buried deep in rubble. The interior, burned out and blackened, revealed casings from the last few shells the crew had used with such devastating accuracy. The tank had fired every round available before the final impact destroyed its engine. Reports written that afternoon described the engagement with clinical detail. They noted the Panther's defensive position, the accuracy of its fire, and the extent to which it had controlled movement across the town. They emphasized that the tank had operated alone, without infantry support, without supply, without hope of relief. A weapon used not for victory, but for delay. Yet among the soldiers who had fought through Waldheim, the memory carried weight beyond official documentation. They knew how close the day had come to collapsing into prolonged stalemate. They knew how many lives had been risked to dislodge that single machine. And they had seen firsthand how determination, training, and the technical precision of one tank crew had created the illusion of a much larger force. The regiment moved on the following day, pushing deeper into Germany as the front advanced eastward. Waldheim remained behind them, a reminder that even in the final months of the war, single moments of resistance could shape the course of a day, a unit, or a memory. Years later, veterans would recall the battle with a mixture of frustration and respect. Many would say that Waldheim taught them a lesson they had almost forgotten. That war was not measured only in numbers or firepower, but in the resolve of the few who held their ground when all odds suggested they could not. The Panther lay rusting in the town's square long after the war ended. Its burnt steel frame became a monument not to victory or defeat, but to endurance. And long after the regiment had returned home, long after the towns were rebuilt and the roads repaired, the memory of that day remained fixed in the minds of those who had been stunned, not by a division, not by a battalion, but by a single tank that refused to yield until the very last moment.